At an elite party, a wealthy woman mocks her black maid's simple attire, only to be captivated when the maid takes the microphone and speaks with confidence and poise. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the sprawling Los Angeles mansion, its Mediterranean architecture gleaming against the backdrop of perfectly manicured palm trees. Luxury vehicles lined the curved driveway, depositing guests dressed in designer were worth more than most people's monthly salaries. Inside, Tiffany Morrison moved through her element like a shark in familiar waters. Her sleek black dress, a custom piece from her latest collection, caught the light from the crystal chandeliers overhead. Professional photographers, carefully positioned throughout the space, captured her every calculated movement. Each flash highlighted her flawless makeup and the diamond necklace that drew attention to her practiced smile. The mansion's grand hall buzzed with a particular energy unique to high society gatherings. Waiters in pressed black uniforms weaved through the crowd, carrying trays of champagne and hors d'oeuvres. The music, a carefully curated playlist of trending ambient tracks, provided the perfect background noise for networking conversations. Fashion editors from major publications clustered around Tiffany, their recorder apps active as she delivered perfectly rehearsed sound bites about her company's commitment to innovation. Her security team maintained a discreet presence, ensuring no uninvited guests could penetrate the carefully controlled environment. The scene shifted when Aisha Thompson entered through a side entrance, her practical work uniform a stark contrast to the evening we're surrounding her. Her sensible shoes squeaked slightly against the marble floor, drawing sharp glances from nearby guests who quickly returned to their conversations. She carried a tablet, checking off items from the event's logistics list, her job requiring her to be invisible yet efficient. The discomfort was evident in Aisha's posture as she navigated through the crowd. Guests shifted away unconsciously, creating a bubble of empty space around her, as if her presence might somehow taint their expensive attire. Her dark skin and practical appearance marked her as staff, and in this world, staff were meant to blend into the background like living furniture. The evening's tension peaked during Tiffany's welcome speech. Standing on the elevated platform near the grand staircase, champagne flute in hand, she commanded attention with practiced ease. The crowd quieted, phones raised to capture the moment for social media. "Welcome to the future of fashion," Tiffany announced, her voice carrying across the room. "Tonight we celebrate not just style, but innovation." She paused for effect, scanning the room with the confidence of someone who knew their power. Her gaze landed on Aisha, who was checking the sound system settings. "You know," Tiffany continued, her tone shifting to something more casual, cruel amusement dancing in her eyes, "some people think fashion is just about clothes. But look around," she gestured to the impeccably dressed crowd. "It's about knowing your place." "Speaking of which, dear," she addressed Aisha directly, "the service entrance is that way." Laughter rippled through the crowd, a mixture of genuine amusement and uncomfortable obligation. Several guests shifted uncomfortably, but none spoke up. The photographers captured the moment, their flashes creating a strobe effect that highlighted the redness creeping up Aisha's neck. Aisha's hands stilled on her tablet. Her shoulders tensed, then straightened. The room seemed to hold its breath as she lifted her gaze to meet Tiffany's, something unreadable passing across her features. Instead of retreating, she squared her shoulders and remained exactly where she stood, her dignity intact despite the attempted humiliation. The moment stretched, electric with unspoken tension. In that silent exchange, something shifted in the room's atmosphere. The easy laughter died away, replaced by an uncomfortable awareness that lingered even as Tiffany smoothly continued her speech, moving on to discuss her company's latest achievements. After the humiliation, Aisha retreated to a quiet corner near one of the floor-to-ceiling windows. From this vantage point, she had a clear view of the party's dynamics unfolding before her. The glass of water in her hand remained untouched as she watched the social performance playing out across the room. Groups formed and dissolved like shifting sand, each interaction carefully calculated. Fashion editors air-kiss social media influencers, their compliments as artificial as their filtered Instagram posts. Industry veterans huddled in corners, trading whispered gossip about upcoming mergers and failed collections. Young designers hovered at the edges, desperately trying to catch the attention of potential investors. From her position, Aisha could see the subtle hierarchies at play. The way certain guests were immediately granted attention while others were politely but firmly ignored. The careful positioning of bodies to exclude unwanted participants from conversations. The practiced laughs and strategic phone checks when uncomfortable topics arose. Her mind drifted to her childhood in Detroit, where similar exclusions played out on a different stage. The memories surfaced uninvited. Being the only black girl in advanced placement classes, the whispered comments about her hair, the assumptions about her family's background. She learned early to carry a notebook everywhere, recording her observations and experiences, turning pain into prose. The weight of her laptop in her work bag seemed to grow heavier. It contained the draft of her novel, a story about identity and belonging that she worked on during lunch breaks and late nights. The same story that had earned nothing but rejection letters from publishers who claimed they couldn't connect with the protagonist's voice. A movement in her peripheral vision caught her attention. A man approached, his casual demeanor at odds with the calculated performances around them. He wore a simple black suit that looked comfortable rather than fashionable, and carried his camera with the ease of someone who viewed it as a tool rather than an accessory. "The lighting's better over here for observing," he said, positioning himself nearby without invading her space. "I'm Lucas Chen, documentary filmmaker." Aisha nodded but didn't respond, her fingers tightening around her water glass. She learned to be wary of friendly faces at events like these. Too often, they came with hidden agendas or disappeared the moment someone more influential entered their orbit. Lucas seemed content with the silence, raising his camera occasionally to capture candid moments of the party. "You know," he said after a while, "I've been to dozens of these events, and they're all the same script with different actors. I'm working on a series about authenticity in artificial spaces." Aisha remained quiet, but her posture relaxed slightly. She watched as he photographed a group of influencers who had to retake their candid group shot multiple times. "I'm particularly interested in voices that get overlooked," Lucas continued, adjusting his lens. "The stories that don't fit the prescribed narrative. I've found they're usually the most compelling." Something in his tone made Aisha turn to study him more carefully. His eyes held genuine interest rather than the practiced enthusiasm she was used to seeing at these events. "I'm working on a story," she said finally, her voice quiet but firm. "About a girl who learns to turn her invisibility into power." Lucas lowered his camera, giving her his full attention. "Tell me more." Aisha hesitated, years of rejection making her cautious. But there was something different about this moment, about Lucas's steady gaze and patient silence. It's about how society trains certain people to be invisible, and what happens when they decide to be seen. "That's exactly the kind of narrative I'm looking for," Lucas said, his enthusiasm genuine rather than performative. "Have you considered adapting it for screen?" Before Aisha could respond, a burst of laughter from Tiffany's group drew their attention. The sound served as a reminder of where they were, of the roles they were expected to play. But something had shifted. In sharing even that small part of her story, Aisha felt a familiar spark of determination. The same feeling that had driven her to write late into the night, to keep submitting her work despite the rejections, to show up in spaces that tried to make her invisible. Lucas sensed her withdrawal and didn't push. Instead, he handed her his business card. "Your story deserves to be heard," he said simply, before moving away to capture more images of the party. Aisha slipped the card into her pocket, her mind already racing with possibilities. The party continued around her, but she was no longer just observing. She was preparing. The champagne-fueled chatter reached a crescendo as Aisha moved purposefully toward the stage. Her heart thundered against her ribs, but her steps remained steady. The grand staircase, with its ornate railings and strategic lighting, had been designed as a showcase for the elite. Tonight, it would serve a different purpose. The DJ's booth, positioned near the platform, provided easy access to the sound system. Aisha's position as event coordinator meant she knew exactly which switches to flip, which cables to access. Her fingers moved with practiced efficiency as she picked up the microphone, the same one Tiffany had used earlier to deliver her cutting remarks. The feedback loop from the microphone created a sharp whine that cut through the party's ambient noise. Heads turned, first in annoyance, then in surprise as they registered who stood at the center of the interruption. Tiffany, mid-conversation with a group of investors, froze with her champagne glass halfway to her lips. "Excuse me." Aisha's voice carried across the room, stronger than she felt. "I have something to say." The murmurs started immediately. Security personnel moved toward the stage, but Lucas, who had positioned himself strategically nearby, stepped forward with his camera rolling. The presence of a documentary filmmaker made them hesitate. No one wanted to be captured manhandling a black woman on camera. "You all came here tonight to celebrate innovation in fashion," Aisha continued, her voice gaining strength. "But innovation isn't just about new designs or sustainable fabrics. It's about new perspectives, new voices." The crowd's reaction split into distinct camps. Some guests turned away, deliberately continuing their conversations. Others watched with uncomfortable fascination, phones discreetly recording. A smaller group, primarily younger attendees and industry outsiders, moved closer to the stage, drawn by the unprecedented break in social protocol. "I've spent years in this industry, watching from the shadows. I've seen how we talk about diversity in public statements but practice exclusion in private spaces. I've written 1,000-word press releases about inclusion while being the only person of color in strategy meetings." The silence deepened. Several guests glanced at Tiffany, whose face had lost its practiced smile. The room's atmosphere grew thick with tension as Aisha continued. "Every day, I work alongside people who never see me. I coordinate your events, proofread your statements, manage your schedules. And every day, I go home and write. I write about girls who look like me, who dream like me, who refuse to be invisible." Her voice cracked slightly, but she pressed on. "You mock my clothes, my appearance, my presence in your spaces. But you never asked why I choose to stay. You never wondered what I might have to say." The silence in the room had transformed from uncomfortable to electric. Even those who had tried to ignore her found themselves listening. Several of Tiffany's closest associates shifted uneasily, avoiding eye contact with their host. "I stay because visibility matters. Because every time you try to make me invisible, you prove why stories like mine need to be told. Because somewhere, there's another girl being told she doesn't belong, and she needs to know she's not alone." Lucas had moved through the crowd, capturing the varied reactions. The young designers who had been desperately seeking attention earlier were now nodding, some wiping away tears. A few senior editors had pulled out notebooks, their professional instincts overriding their social discomfort. Tiffany remained frozen in place, but her expression had shifted. The carefully maintained mask of superiority cracked, revealing something more complex underneath. Recognition? Remembrance? Whatever it was, it made her lower her champagne glass and really look at Aisha, perhaps for the first time. "Your jokes about the service entrance?" Aisha's voice grew stronger. "They say more about you than they do about me. They reveal the walls you've built around yourselves, walls that keep you safe, but also keep you small." The silence that followed these words was absolute. No clicking glasses, no whispered comments, no shuffling feet. Just the weight of truth, finally spoken aloud in a space designed to avoid it. As Aisha's words hung in the air, something shifted in the room's energy. The carefully constructed hierarchy of the evening began to crack, letting in something raw and real. It was as if someone had opened a window in a stuffy room, allowing fresh air to circulate for the first time. The atmosphere in the room crackled with unspoken energy as Aisha's words settled over the crowd. Lucas's camera whirred softly as he captured the ripple effect moving through the assembled guests. His hands moved with practiced precision, documenting the subtle shifts in body language, the dawning recognition on faces, the quiet nods of understanding. In the corner, a group of young designers huddled together, their earlier attempts at networking forgotten. One of them, wearing a recycled fashion piece she designed herself, wiped tears from her eyes while nodding vigorously. Another pulled out his phone, not to record, but to pull up his own collection of rejection letters, showing them to his companions with new confidence. Lucas scribbled furiously in his notepad between shots, his filmmaker's instinct telling him he was witnessing something extraordinary. The way the room had transformed from a typical industry event into a moment of genuine human connection wasn't just good footage. It was the kind of authentic storytelling he'd been searching for. "This is it," he muttered to himself, adjusting his camera angle. "This is what breaks through the facade." Meanwhile, Tiffany stood rooted to her spot, her usual poise replaced by something more vulnerable. Her fingers traced the edge of her champagne glass, a nervous gesture she hadn't displayed since her early days in the industry. As Aisha's words about walls and safety resonated through the room, Tiffany's carefully maintained expression began to crack. Her mind wandered to a memory she'd buried deep. A teenage girl in off-brand clothes, standing before a mirror in a department store, dreams of belonging written across her face. The same girl who'd learned to weaponize appearance after years of being the outsider, who'd built her empire on the very insecurities that had once plagued her. The security team, still uncertain about how to handle the situation, looked to Tiffany for direction. But their usual protocols seemed inadequate for this moment. How do you shut down truth when it demands to be heard? Across the room, guests began sharing their own stories in hushed voices. A prominent magazine editor admitted to changing her name to sound more table to the industry. A successful model spoke quietly about her struggles with an eating disorder, maintained to meet impossible standards. Each confession created space for another, like dominoes falling in slow motion. Tiffany's attention was drawn to a photograph on the wall behind her, one from her first major fashion show. In it, she stood proud and defiant, having just proven everyone wrong about what she could achieve. But now, with Aisha's words echoing in her ears, she saw something different in that image, a woman who'd survived by becoming what had once hurt her. The realization hit her with physical force, causing her to step backward slightly. A waiter moved to steady her, but for once, she didn't immediately right herself into perfect posture. Instead, she allowed herself to feel the weight of the moment, to really see the parallel between Aisha's current position and her own past struggles. Lucas captured this moment of vulnerability, his camera focusing on the subtle play of emotions across Tiffany's face. In his viewfinder, she transformed from the untouchable fashion icon into something more complex and human. The footage would later become a pivotal scene in his documentary, showcasing how authentic stories can crack even the most polished facades. The party's carefully curated playlist continued to play in the background, but it had become white noise to the more compelling sound of truth being spoken and heard. The contrast between the artificial atmosphere they'd created and the genuine emotions now filling the space couldn't have been more stark. As Aisha's words continued to resonate, the invisible barriers between us and them, between those who belonged and those who served, began to dissolve. In their place, a new kind of connection emerged, one based on shared humanity rather than shared privilege. The next moments unfolded with the weight of inevitability. Tiffany set her champagne glass down on a nearby table with deliberate care, her perfectly manicured fingers trembling slightly. The sound of her heels against the marble floor echoed through the hushed room as she made her way toward the stage. Security tensed again, but Tiffany waved them off with an authority that brooked no argument. Her approach to the stage was measured, each step seeming to shed layers of her carefully constructed persona. By the time she reached Aisha, the practiced smile and defensive posture had disappeared entirely. "I need the microphone," Tiffany said, her voice quiet but firm. Aisha hesitated for a moment before handing it over, her expression guarded but curious. The room held its collective breath, social media forgotten, as everyone waited to see what would happen next. "I owe you an apology," Tiffany began, her voice cracking slightly. "Not just for tonight, but for every time I've used my position to make you feel less than." She paused, gathering herself. "The truth is, your presence reminds me of everything I've tried to forget about myself." The admission hung in the air, heavy with implications. Several guests shifted uncomfortably, recognizing their own reflections in Tiffany's words. Lucas's camera whirred steadily, documenting this unprecedented moment of vulnerability from one of fashion's most guarded figures. When I started in this industry, Tiffany continued, I was told I didn't belong. Wrong background, wrong connections, wrong everything. I survived by becoming what they wanted, or what I thought they wanted. Her voice strengthened as she spoke directly to Aisha. But in doing so, I became exactly what I once hated. Aisha stood perfectly still, her expression a complex mixture of emotions. The tablet she usually carried like a shield hung forgotten at her side. Around them, the party's artificial atmosphere had completely dissolved, replaced by something raw and real. Your courage tonight, Tiffany said, in standing up and speaking your truth. It's what I should have done years ago. Instead, I built walls and called them success. She turned to address the wider room. We all did. We created an industry that talks about innovation while clinging to the same old prejudices. Several industry veterans nodded slowly, their own carefully maintained facades beginning to crack. A famous designer in the corner wiped away tears, smudging her perfect makeup. An influential blogger closed his laptop, for once more interested in the moment than in documenting it. I can't undo years of behavior with one apology, Tiffany acknowledged, turning back to Aisha. But I can start making changes now. She reached out, offering her hand. Your voice deserves to be heard. Your stories need to be told. And I want to help make that happen, not as your boss, but as someone who finally remembers what it means to be real. The gesture hung between them, laden with significance. The room waited, aware they were witnessing something unprecedented in their carefully choreographed world. Lucas zoomed in on their hands, Tiffany's adorned with designer rings, reaching out to Aisha's, strong and unadorned. After what felt like an eternity, Aisha stepped forward and took Tiffany's hand. The contact was brief, but meaningful, a bridge forming between two worlds that had seemed impossibly far apart just hours before. When they embraced, the action was neither staged nor performed. It was simply human. The room erupted in applause, not the polite, measured kind common at such events, but something genuine and spontaneous. Tears flowed freely now, makeup was forgotten, and the carefully maintained social hierarchy of the evening crumbled completely. The party's transformation was immediate and profound. The carefully orchestrated networking event dissolved into something more authentic as guests abandoned their practice poses and rehearsed conversations. Small groups formed organically around the room, no longer divided by status or influence, but united by shared experiences. In one corner, a veteran fashion editor removed her designer heels, settling comfortably on a plush ottoman as she shared stories about her early days in the industry. I changed my accent, she admitted to the younger designers gathered around her. Practiced in front of a mirror until I sounded like them. Now I can't even remember what my real voice sounds like. Near the bar, a successful model spoke openly about her journey, her words carrying weight beyond their usual scripted interviews. Every rejection came with a different reason, she explained, gesturing with her untouched cocktail. Too ethnic, too urban, too authentic. Until you start believing there's something wrong with being yourself. Lucas moved through these groups with his camera, capturing the raw honesty of the moments. His documentary was evolving before his eyes from a critique of artificial spaces into a testament to the power of authentic connection. He paused occasionally to make notes, marking timestamps of particularly powerful confessions. This isn't just about fashion anymore, he murmured into his recorder. It's about the masks we wear and what happens when we dare to remove them. Approaching Aisha, who stood slightly apart observing the scene, Lucas cleared his throat. There's a panel next month at the Creative Industry Summit, he said. The theme is breaking barriers in creative spaces. After what I've witnessed tonight, I can't think of a more powerful voice to add to that conversation. Aisha's initial instinct was to decline, years of conditioning making her hesitate. But the events of the evening had shifted something fundamental in her understanding of her own power. What exactly would this involve? She asked, her voice steady. You'd be speaking alongside other changemakers in the industry, Lucas explained, pulling up the details on his phone. People who've challenged the status quo and created space for new voices. Your story, especially after tonight, could peer others to speak up. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of several guests, each eager to share their own experiences or express support. Among them was a literary agent who'd been quietly observing the evening's events unfold. "Your words resonated deeply," the agent said, handing Aisha her card. "If your writing is half as powerful as your speech tonight, we need to talk." The industry is finally ready for stories that challenge our comfortable narratives. Throughout the room, similar connections were forming. The artificial barriers that had defined the industry for so long were crumbling, replaced by genuine interest in different perspectives and experiences. Phones were pulled out not for selfies, but to exchange contact information and make real plans for collaboration. Tiffany, who had been moving through the crowd, having meaningful conversations for perhaps the first time at one of her own events, returned to where Aisha stood. Her makeup was slightly smudged from tears and hugs, but she seemed more alive than she had all evening. "This energy," she gestured around the room, "this honesty, this is what our industry has been missing. We've been so focused on appearance that we forgot about substance." She turned to Aisha with newfound respect. "Your courage tonight didn't just challenge me. It's challenging everyone to be better." The evening continued to unfold in this new direction, with conversations deepening and connections strengthening. What had begun as another exclusive industry event had transformed into a catalyst for change, proving that sometimes the most powerful fashion statements are the ones that strip away the artifice and reveal the truth beneath. In the days following the party, the impact of that night began to spread like ripples in a pond. Social media, usually filled with carefully filtered images and curated content, buzzed with raw, unedited accounts of what had transpired. The video clips of Aisha's speech and Tiffany's response, captured by various guests, spread rapidly across platforms. Tiffany's first Instagram post after the event marked a dramatic departure from her usual polished content. The image showed her sitting at her desk, makeup-free, holding Aisha's draft manuscript. The caption read, "For years, I've been part of the problem. It's time to be part of the solution. Real change starts with real stories." Hashtag authentic voices, hashtag time for change. The post, so different from her typical perfectly staged photos, garnered unprecedented engagement. Industry insiders and outsiders alike filled the comment section with their own stories of exclusion, pressure to conform, and the toll of maintaining appearances. The hashtag authentic voices began trending, spawning thousands of similar revelations across the fashion and media landscape. Journalists descended upon the story, each wanting an exclusive angle. Their requests flooded both women's inboxes, but rather than rushing to capitalize on the moment, they chose their platforms carefully. Aisha found herself fielding calls from major publications, all eager to hear more about her journey and her writing. Ms. Thompson, one particularly persistent reporter from Vogue, cornered her outside her apartment. "Your confrontation with Tiffany Morrison has become a symbol of changing power dynamics in the fashion industry. How does it feel to be at the center of this movement?" Aisha considered her response carefully. "This isn't about one moment or one person," she replied. "It's about years of silent voices finally finding the courage to speak. The real story isn't what happened at the party. It's what happens next." Meanwhile, Tiffany faced her own media scrutiny. Some critics called her public apology a calculated move, while others praised her vulnerability. Fashion blogs dissected her every subsequent appearance, noting how her signature polished image had softened, allowing glimpses of authenticity to show through. The corporate response was equally swift. Competing fashion houses rushed to announce diversity initiatives and inclusive hiring practices. Industry publications scrambled to feature more diverse voices and perspectives. But amidst this flood of sudden consciousness, Aisha's words continued to resonate. Real change isn't about announcements. It's about sustained action. In her office, now transformed into a more welcoming space, Tiffany reviewed proposals for a new mentorship program. The initiative, developed in consultation with Aisha, would provide support and opportunities for emerging voices in fashion and literature. Her phone buzzed constantly with messages from industry colleagues, some supportive, others concerned about the disruption to their comfortable status quo. "They're afraid," Tiffany remarked to Aisha during one of their now regular meetings. "Not of change itself, but of what they might see when they look in the mirror." The most significant changes, however, happened quietly. Junior staff members began speaking up in meetings, their ideas received with new attention. Design teams actively sought diverse perspectives. The rigid hierarchy that had defined the industry began to show cracks, allowing fresh air into stagnant spaces. Aisha's inbox filled with messages from others who had felt invisible in their own industries. A young architect sharing her struggles in a male-dominated field. A medical resident writing about racial bias in healthcare. A tech worker describing the subtle exclusions in Silicon Valley. Her story had become a catalyst for conversations far beyond the fashion world. "Your courage gave me courage," read one message. "Today I spoke up in a meeting for the first time." They actually listened. As the media frenzy continued, both women remained focused on creating lasting change rather than capitalizing on temporary attention. They understood that real transformation happens not in dramatic moments, but in the quiet, consistent work of dismantling old systems and building new ones. 3 months after the party, Aisha stood at the podium of the National Fashion Industry Conference, no longer in a service uniform, but dressed in a way that reflected her own style. Comfortable, professional, and authentically herself. The audience before her included many familiar faces from that transformative night, though their dynamic had shifted dramatically. Tiffany sat in the front row, her presence now supportive rather than intimidating. She traded her usual power suits for a more relaxed, but equally elegant ensemble, the change in her wardrobe reflecting deeper internal shifts. Next to her, Lucas adjusted his camera, documenting this latest development in what had become a compelling narrative about industry transformation. When we talk about diversity in fashion, Aisha began her keynote speech. We often focus on what's visible, the models on our runways, the faces in our campaigns. But true diversity runs deeper. It's about whose stories we tell, whose voices we amplify, and whose dreams we nurture. The industry veterans in attendance, many of whom had once dismissed her, now leaned forward in their seats, taking notes. Several major fashion houses had sent representatives specifically to hear her perspective on creating authentic inclusion in their brands. During the networking session that followed, Tiffany introduced Aisha to key figures in the industry, this time not as her employee, but as an equal whose insight was valued. The conversations that ensued were markedly different from the superficial exchanges that had once dominated such events. "Your manuscript opened my eyes," admitted a prominent publisher who had previously rejected Aisha's work. "We've been so focused on what we think sells that we've missed what actually matters to readers." The implementation of their joint initiatives had begun, showing concrete results. The mentorship program had already paired 30 emerging creators with established industry figures. More importantly, these relationships weren't just about fashion. They crossed boundaries between writing, design, media, and activism. "Show them your latest project," Tiffany encouraged, gesturing to a group of interested investors. Aisha pulled out her tablet, displaying the prototype for a new digital platform that would showcase underrepresented creators across multiple industries. The platform, born from their shared vision, would provide not just visibility, but practical support, resources, connections, and opportunities that had traditionally been reserved for those within the industry's inner circle. Several major brands had already committed to supporting the initiative, recognizing the value of authentic diversity in their creative processes. "It's not charity," Aisha explained to the investors. "It's good business. Fresh perspectives drive innovation. Authentic stories create genuine connections with audiences. Diversity isn't just a buzzword. It's the future of creative industries." During a private moment between sessions, Tiffany shared news with Aisha about upcoming changes in her company's leadership structure. "We're restructuring the creative department," she explained. "I want you to head it. Not because of what happened at the party, but because you understand something fundamental about storytelling that we've been missing." The offer represented more than a promotion. It was an acknowledgement that real change required new perspectives at all levels of leadership. Aisha considered the proposition carefully, aware that her response would influence others watching their journey. "I'll consider it," she replied thoughtfully, "but I want to ensure the role allows me to continue my writing and advocacy work. Change happens when we maintain our authentic voices, not when we simply fit into existing structures." Tiffany nodded, understanding. Their relationship had evolved into something neither woman had expected, a partnership based on mutual respect and a shared commitment to transformation. The fashion industry was watching their example, but more importantly, other industries were taking notice. The grand ballroom of the Creative Arts Foundation hummed with anticipation. Unlike the party where this journey began, tonight's gathering had a different energy, one of genuine celebration rather than social performance. Aisha stood backstage, preparing to receive the Foundation's Catalyst Award for her contributions to transformative storytelling in creative industries. The past 6 months had brought changes neither woman could have predicted. Aisha's novel, finally published by a major house, had become a bestseller, its raw honesty about identity and belonging resonating far beyond the fashion world. Tiffany sat in the audience, watching as the industry that had once epitomized exclusivity celebrated the very voice it had tried to silence. For her courage in challenging established narratives, the presenter announced, and her ongoing work in creating spaces for authentic voices across creative industries, we present this year's Catalyst Award to Aisha Thompson. As Aisha stepped onto the stage, the applause felt different from the polite acknowledgments she'd grown used to. This was recognition of real impact, of concrete change. Her acceptance speech was characteristically direct. "This award isn't just about one moment of speaking up," she began. "It's about all the moments of staying silent that came before it. It's about every person who's ever felt they had to shrink themselves to fit into spaces that weren't built for them." In the audience, several faces showed tears of recognition. Even established industry figures found themselves nodding, perhaps remembering their own struggles with authenticity in a world obsessed with appearance. Meanwhile, Tiffany faced her own challenges. Social media had been brutal in the weeks following the party, with some critics calling her transformation performative. Fashion blogs scrutinized her every move, waiting for her to slip back into old patterns. But she remained committed to the change, even when it cost her some long-standing industry relationships. "I lost some friends," she confided to Aisha earlier that day. "But I gained something more valuable, the ability to look in the mirror and recognize myself." And if you cherish your family and love stories like this, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and avoid 10 years of bad luck. During a particularly poignant moment in her speech, Aisha addressed the criticism both women had faced. Change isn't always comfortable. It's not meant to be. Real transformation requires us to sit with our discomfort, to examine our roles in maintaining systems that hurt others and ourselves. The media coverage of their story had evolved from initial sensation to thoughtful analysis. Industry publications that had once focused exclusively on trends and transactions now regularly feature discussions about authenticity, representation, and the true cost of maintaining appearances. Their shared initiatives had begun showing measurable impact. The mentorship program had expanded to multiple cities, the digital platform was thriving, and more importantly, other industries were adopting their model of authentic inclusion. When we celebrate voices that challenge us, Aisha continued, her voice strong, we create space for growth. Every story shared becomes a bridge to understanding. Every truth spoken makes room for more truth. As she concluded her speech, the emotional weight in the room was palpable. This wasn't just about fashion anymore. It was about the power of authentic voices to create lasting change. Later, during the reception, Tiffany approached the podium where Aisha had spoken, touching it thoughtfully. "You know," she said when Aisha joined her, "I used to think power meant making others feel small. Now I understand it's about making space for others to grow." The evening of the publishing gala shimmered with possibility. Aisha stood in the grand foyer of the Metropolitan Publishing House, her manuscript finally bound and ready for worldwide release. The journey from that fateful party to this moment felt both endless and instantaneous. As celebration champagne flowed, Aisha's phone buzzed with the news that would shake both women's worlds. The email from Regina Walsh, editor-in-chief of Walsh Publishing, one of the most prestigious houses in the industry, expressed intense interest in acquiring her book for international distribution. Tiffany, who had been sharing industry connections with Aisha, froze when she saw the name on the email. Her champagne glass trembled slightly as memories flooded back. A teenage Tiffany, desperately trying to fit in at her first fashion internship, and Regina Walsh, the senior editor who had publicly humiliated her for her discount store appearance. Regina Walsh, Tiffany whispered, her voice barely audible above the party's buzz. I haven't heard that name in 20 years. Aisha, caught up in the excitement of the offer, initially missed the change in Tiffany's demeanor. You know her? Know her? Tiffany's laugh held no humor. She's the reason I became who I was. The person who taught me that cruelty was power. The revelation landed between them like a physical presence. Aisha watched as Tiffany's carefully reconstructed confidence seemed to waver, old wounds visibly reopening. She took one look at my handmade clothes, my obvious desperation to belong, and she destroyed me in front of everyone, Tiffany continued. Said I'd never understand true style because you can't buy class. I spent the next 20 years proving her wrong, or trying to. The parallel wasn't lost on either woman. How cycles of hurt perpetuate themselves, how victims of cruelty sometimes become its perpetrators. The realization that Tiffany had unconsciously modeled her form. Her behavior on her own tormentor added layers of complexity to their shared journey. But something was different now. Instead of retreating into old patterns of defensive behavior, Tiffany straightened her shoulders and looked at Aisha with clear eyes. Take the deal, she said firmly. Your voice deserves to be heard, and Regina Walsh's company can make that happen. Don't let my old scars diminish your opportunity to shine. This moment marked more than just a publishing deal. It represented the true breaking of cycles. Tiffany's ability to put Aisha's success above her own past pain demonstrated how far she'd come from the woman who had once used humiliation as a shield. We're not going to let her play the same game, Aisha decided, her voice strong with determination. We'll meet her as equals, both of us. Your story deserves to be heard too. The following week, when they walked into Regina Walsh's office together, they represented something powerful. The transformation that happens when women choose to lift each other up instead of tearing each other down. Regina, now older but still commanding, looked up from Aisha's manuscript with surprise when she saw Tiffany. Recognition flickered across her face, followed by something that might have been shame. Well, she said, putting down the manuscript, it seems we have more to discuss than just a book deal. That meeting became another turning point, not just for Aisha's book or Tiffany's healing, but for the industry itself. Three women, connected by cycles of pain and power, choosing to break those cycles together. As they left the publishing house later that day, Tiffany turned to Aisha. You know what the real story is? She asked, smiling genuinely. It's not about fashion or publishing or success. It's about how being seen, really seen, by one person can change everything. The two women stood there, equals at last, ready to write the next chapter together.